Let's talk about Psalm 149. This is the last psalm that we will study together, where I am your resident rabbi. As Mike reminded us, we are not going to study 150. That's going to be, a special culmination with Rabbi Kleinbaum and the group. Don't expect it any sooner than August. When next week you study with Rabbi Moskowitz, you'll be going into a different psalm. And tomorrow, my friends, is our musical journey through the Psukei de Zimra. Thank you so much to Cantor Nimi and also to Chazan Hirsch. Cantor Nimi is putting together a compilation of some of the most beautiful settings of these psalms that we've studied from 145 to 149. And when we talk about Psalm 149, you will see shortly, if it is not a part of your daily Hallel practice, why it's not quite as familiar as some of the other ones that we've been studying in this rubric. You'll be able to see features that define the Psukei de Zimra daily Hallel, like an opening and closing of Hallelujah, an underlying theme of praise. But this psalm is complicated in its different levels of emotional landscape. 148, as we talked about yesterday, is just a lovely psalm. It's a joy. It's really fun. It's like all one note, happy, clappy optimism, rainbows in the sky. And Psalm 150 also sort of has that feeling for us. And Psalm 149 is complicated. So let's look at it. May I have a Hebrew reader and an English reader for this our psalm today? Who just said, can I read English?
Shep.
Shep can read English.
It's my native language.
Bless you. Excellent. Ora, I see you, and we got you yesterday. And Jeremy,
I'll read Hebrew.
Jeremy will read Hebrew. Sarah, is that okay with you? You were first to the pitch, but.
And that's all right. I'll let Sarah read it.
Okay. Sarah, you're muted.
Jeremy, are you sure? Because I've read one.
Yeah,
right.
Jeremy, why don't you do this one?
All right.
And then Shep will read the English. Go for it, Jeremy.
Hallelujah. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash tehilato bichal hasidim. Yismach Yisrael be'osav b'nei Tzion yagelu b'maltam. Yehalelu shemo b'machol b'tov v'chinor yezamru lo. Ki rotze Adonai be'amo yifa'er anavim b'shua. Yazu hasidim b'kavod yiranu al mish kivotam. Romamu el bin ronam v'cherev pefiot bi'adam. La'asot nikama b'noam.
Bagoyim.
Sorry. Nakama bagoyim.
Mm-hmm.
Tochechot b'la'umim. La'asor malkachem b'zikim v'niv b'rachem b'chalei barzel. La'asot b'chem mishpat kahu hadar hu l'chol hasidim. Hallelujah.
Very nice. All right, Shep, I'm going back up to the top.
Okay.
Let's hear the English.
Hallelujah. Sing to the Lord a new song, his praises in the congregation of the faithful. Let Israel rejoice in its maker. Let the children of Zion exult in their king. Let them praise his name in dance. with timbrel and lyre, let them chant his praises. For the Lord delights in his people. He adorns the lowly with victory. Let the faithful exult in glory. Let them shout for joy upon their couches. With paeans of God in their throats and two-edged swords in their hands, to impose retribution upon the nations, punishment upon the peoples, binding their kings with shackles, their nobles with chains of iron, executing the doom decreed against them. This is the glory of all his faithful. Hallelujah. Started good, ended bad. Oh gosh, so grim.
Sorry about that. There was a garbage truck outside, so I muted myself for just a second. And yeah, Shep, it took a turn. We'll say it took a turn for the militaristic. Is that a fair adjective? Somewhat without judgment. Yeah, and you know, it's very much in line with 148, very much in line with 150. Look at verse 3. We can sort of anticipate all of these musical instruments. Has themes of God's special attention to the lowly or the meek, as we saw in 146, rewarding the faithful. And then here we go, verse 7, we turn and talk about what's going to happen to those who are not the faithful. Linda Solomon, what does this bring up for you?
Well, when I read it before class started, it you know, took me aback after reading the 148, and then the Mitsuda says this psalm continues the theme of the previous psalm, so that really took me back. But what I find in Levi is the translation is even more dire than this Sephardic one, because Levi uses the words vengeance and chastisement, and that really.
Linda, would you tell us, tell me the verse, and if you would read that translation, that would be great.
7. Well, it starts 6. Let high praises of God resound deep in their throats, a mouth-wide sword in their hand, taking vengeance on the peoples, chastisement on the nations, chaining their rulers, shackling their nobles, taking them the judgment to them the judgment inscribed. So it really gives you a grisha there.
Yeah, it sure does. The one thing before I call on Sarah that I want to point out is a particular interpretation of Psalm 6, which I find really fascinating. Line 6 of Psalm 149. And this is kind of that pivot point, right? The appearance of a sword all of a sudden changes the tone of the psalm in a very distinct direction. But if you look at verse 6, just all by itself, what I think is really fascinating is imagine this as a description of King David. You know, we've talked a lot about, can we really attribute the authorship of the Psalms to King David? And there are good reasons for and good reasons against. But isn't this beautiful that as an expression of the aspiration, you know, what we hope to achieve in our existence is to be offering romemot, you know, peons, praise, beautiful songs to God in our throats, but also to have a two-edged sword in our hand. And sort of uniquely, this is one of the descriptions that we often ascribe to King David as a sweet singer of Israel, a lyreist. Lisa Brown can correct me how I would describe the noun for that type of musician, a poet, but also a very fierce and frankly sort of bloodthirsty military might in general. Okay, Sarah, and then I saw Ben, I see Dean's hand up, and I saw Dratfield's hand, but maybe they changed their minds. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, it seems very drastic when the psalm switches from the pleasantness to the militaristic. And I was going to say, in terms of how it's used in Psuke de Zimra, most of Psuke de Zimra is pleasant and light. And then to have this, it's very, very jarring.
Mm-hmm. And then what comes next? Psalm 150.
50, yeah.
It's a lot. You're right, Sarah. All right, Ben.
With respect, I beg to differ about isolating verse 6.
Okay, tell
Not
me.
everything. Verse 7 makes no sense apart from verse 6.
Right.
And additionally, King David was militaristic, but he was militaristic in terms of political conquest. None of his battles and conquests had to do with taking revenge on other nations who wronged Israel.
Philistines.
But he conquered a lot more. He went north and east,
Yeah,
apart from the Philistines.
apart from the, okay. Ben, I absolutely respect your disagreement. What I want to clarify is not that we should like completely just read verse 6 by itself without all of the context. I think it's an interesting added interpretive level. And you're right. I think that its function in the psalm is to get us to verse 7. It should not be completely excised and read on its own. But you and I will continue to parry back and forth about that particular interpretation of King David. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Dean.
Two things. I just want to share that Bernstein's interpretation of this, I find fascinating. So I'll just, if I may, Rabbi, I'll just read the summary here.
Sure, please.
When all pleasure stems from power, grabbed or self-ordained, people fall or even jump from the towers they have made.
Ooh.
Eternal law foresees the falls and sees the falls sustained by justice, splendor of the wise who reign with the words of God. So just wanted to share that. I'm sort of with her in that I'm not reading it militaristically necessarily or whatever, but we have this problem, is that human beings do terrible things.
Mm-hmm.
The tragedy of the last five centuries of colonialism cannot be understated. Of how much damage we did, not only to people, but to the planet. So, you know, I need God's protection. And that isn't always a walk in the park. I'll leave it at that.
Very, very artfully said, Jenny. Thank you, Dean. And I was excited to see Ginny's hand up. Go ahead, Ginny.
This is a great little quick story, and I'll be really fast about it. And what I grew up with a Christian mother and a Jewish father. So my Christian mother would say, well, how many stones were in King David's quiver when he slayed Goliath? And when we finally came up with the answer of 5, then mother would chuckle and say, and what were the other 4 stones? Kind of look at him, and then he would say, but the other 4 stones were so that he could quickly hit the others, pick up the sword, and decapitate them all. So I don't know if that is an interesting story for
It is.
anybody who needed to know the strength of the military powers of King David, but I thought it was hilarious, and especially my mother's reaction of horror.
Marvelous. Thank you for sharing that, Jenny. Nice to hear your voice. All right,
Thank you.
Stephen, go right ahead.
Hi there. Thanks.
Good morning.
Good morning. You know, if we think of the Psalms in a metaphorical level, and I tend to like to think of it that way, that the enemies are our internal demons.
Ooh.
And if we're working very hard to get rid of the negative and turn toward the light and turn toward that hallelujah moment, we have to cause retribution on those negative impulses that we have. And I like to think of that as the kings and the nobles,
Sure.
the chains of iron is the stuff that holds me back from really
Yeah.
flying. So it might be a very convenient reframe, because I really want to like the poetry and the history of 2,500 and I think more years into our unconscious minds. So I look at the Psalms, I'm starting to as a dream state in which the light, the goodness, the creator conquers the evil kings with their shackles and their
Right.
nobles of iron.
And I think that that's a valuable double-edged sword to consider the reading of the Psalms. What does it look like on the one edge as externally focused, and what does it look like on the other edge as internally focused? What would this mean if the Psalm was directed at the self? I love that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm seeing a note from Monica in the chat. You know, what if we read this as a populist readings, that it's about overthrowing kings and nobles and giving power to the Anavim, the people who are sort of at the lowest strata. I think that is a fascinating way to read this. Okay, who was next? I think it was Lisa and then Jeremy. And I'll keep moving through. Oh, wait, actually, Joan Friedman had a hand up and then a hand down. So Joan's going to go after Jeremy.
So just a small textual note on, once again, on the instruments. So I'm really interested that they have, that this is the Sepharia. This is verse, oh gosh, oh, 3.
3.
You know, so where they have, where the English is translated, the root, the Zemer root, Zion Mem Resh, or, you know, ZMR to our English, that they translate that as chant. And I find that really interesting, because it's usually translated as sing hymns.
Yep.
But here it's translated as chant, and it's for a very particular reason, that it's combined with dancing, right, Michal? So they're talking about people dancing. Dancing is always associated with the women and with drums and with chanting. So women don't sing, women chant. And it's a very distinct difference in the text. And what I've read in some of the books, I'm not sure if they're still current, but Friedman has a book that a lot of the psukim and the verses where Miriam is dancing and chanting, they're more pagan, right? They're earlier texts, and they are identified as actually historically earlier texts that appear in the Tanakh. Hopefully this is still true, but this is what I've read.
Thank you for bringing in that perspective. That is absolutely fascinating. All right, Jeremy.
Sorry, they're also disappeared. You know, the drums and the women and the chanting get disappeared.
Oh, yes. Yes, and a lot of those primitive, primordial elements and recognition of feminine nature of God, or, you know, singularly feminine expression of God. I've got a great book for anybody who wants to read about Asherah. All right, Jeremy, go right ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that not only does man do some horrible things, but so does God.
Oh, yes. We have much in common there, don't we?
Yes, and that we are God's creation, and we got that from Adonai. And high praises of God resound deep in their throats, that open-throated cry to praise God with a sword in your hand, and charging with love of God to those who don't, is less warlike to me, especially when, as Monica points out, that it's chaining their rulers and shackling their nobles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not the whole people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done with the passion of praising God. Now, of course, so the Crusades would say they were doing that, but
Yeah.
let's draw lines just for ourselves.
All right. And I see that people are answering Yudit in the chat. And I just want to show you exactly the Hebrew word, which has been transliterated, but look, it's right here. That's what we mean by machol, that third word in line 3. Lisa put it into transliteration and into Hebrew characters. Thank you, thank you. And, you know, Stephen, completely fair reading about, like, you know, is God a convenient target for what we as humans would do anyway, and then we create a God that is in that image. Very, very interesting.
God is busy doing other things, I think.
All right, so Joan Friedman, I want to say that I saw your hand and I see what you've put into the chat, but
right. So I just wanted to say that one way to read Psalm 149 is that it's in this tradition of victory songs, which actually were originally songs that the women sang to the men when they came back from battle. You know.
Yeah, you know, this has a historical context.
And the Song of the Sea, I've seen arguments that the Song of the Sea was probably originally really sung all by the women because it's in that same tradition. And so it's not that it's like, yay, God, oh, and now we're going to talk about vengeance. You know, it's like, hooray, we're celebrating what God did, which is that instead of our enemies trouncing us, our soldiers trounced them.
Yeah, which is an expression of gratitude and praise. It's exactly as you said, Joan, can be read as a straight line, not a pivot. Probably in historical context, that's the right way to do it. Pointing out Monica's reading suggestion in the chat, and then Judy Hollander, I definitely will either at the end of class pull that suggested reading, or I'll put it in the Facebook group, or I'll send it to Harold to send out. But what are you thinking about this morning as you read Psalm 149?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I'm asking you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I was going back to the double-edged sword or the two-edged sword.
Ooh.
I just think that's sort of protection. You can go one way or the other. And I see it. I mean, I'm not sure how it fits in the whole thing, but it's like we're having this, it's a kind of just in case is the way I was reading it.
Right. You said an ace in the hole in the chat.
Yeah, you go one way or the other way. We have this, maybe, you know, we don't have to use it. That's the way I was seeing it, as an added protection. Although it startled me, I must admit, but I think that sometimes we are too 21st century where, you know, why can't we all get along when in this kind of a setting, maybe this vengeance and these kinds of things are more realistic.
Yeah, I think that's fair and right. And also good for us to be consistently rereading these words in the 21st century and thinking about them and addressing them and saying, like, in our context, they don't fit as well. And what does this mean when we put ourselves back into the minds of their original authors and their original readers? But this is what's beautiful about Jewish tradition and about continuous lifelong Jewish learning. Thank you, Judy. Nice to see you and your carnation toned locks. Reaching for people who have not spoken yet. So Randy Sarakoff, and then I see you, Sherry. I see you. You're after Randy.
Good morning from Kane University. I was able to steal a few minutes to be here. And
so glad you're here.
So thank you, with gratitude for this class. So I've gone in a different direction. When we verse 3, I thought Debbie Friedman's song.
Yeah, of course.
And
good call.
So now I'm back in the desert with Moses and the Israelites. And now I'm brought to Rabbi Kleinbaum's drash from a couple of weeks ago, where she talks about a parsha where Moses sends a representative from each of the 12 tribes in to check out the land. They come back and only 2 of them think that we have a possibility of being able to take the people, which was war. So to me, this kind of brings that all together. First, we praise God, and God will protect us enough and be with us that we will win and be able to take the promised land. I go with this.
Very cool, Randy. I'm glad that it's like integrating your study of Parshat HaShavua, of where we are in our Torah cycle, as we are experiencing it through the Ketuvim, through the writing section. You've covered all of the Tanakh in that metaphor. Thank you. All right, Sherry.
Well, following what Randy said, it's very interesting to me, these 2 individuals that came back and said, yes, we can, yes, we can. I'm riveted to verse 9.
All right, here we go.
Alter and Levi seem to have a similar bent on this line. Alter says, to exact from them justice as is written. Levi says, taking to them the judgment inscribed. And they both talk about this idea, a notion of a divine book of destiny, the promise to exact from them. I'm just going to read the footnotes because I think they're very important. Alter says, the reference could be to a canonical text, such as the promise of victory over the nations, if Israel is loyal to its covenant that one finds in Deuteronomy. It could also refer to some notion of a divine book of destiny, an idea that occurs in several ancient cultures. And then Levi says, taking to them the judgment inscribed. Taking is the same verb, la'asot, literally to make, used for vengeance in verse 7. The judgment seems to have been inscribed, that is, made in heaven. And this all leads me to the idea of free will and determinism. If something's inscribed in heaven, it's something that must be undertaken. You had to have those 2 individuals who said, yes, we can, from Randy's reference. And I think about that in terms of Israel, promised the promised land. Okay, so now we have Israel. And if you read Levi, he focuses on this a little bit. Okay, so we have Israel. And now we had to take certain steps in order to be secure, to secure our nation. Now we have our nation, and now what? Is that also inscribed? Is it free will that we can either sort of obliterate all the other nations so we can continue? Or is it determinism that we must continue to exert ourselves? I don't understand. To me, it seems like this, and throughout the Tanakh, it's almost like determinism. And those who don't agree are going to be shackled in chains of iron, and they're going, the vengeance is ours. And yet, where's the free will? If it's all determinism, then what powers do we have to restrain ourselves even? It's very concerning to me, this idea of determinism that I see.
I hear you, and I would bring in Judy's suggestion in conversation with yours. When we think to the ancient Near East, when we look with our 21st century eyes and say, but where is free will? You know, like this is frankly upsetting to us that it doesn't appear here, and that it is so furiously deterministic. In the world of the psalmist and the psalmist listeners, very few things felt truly in control. And that wasn't just military victory or defeat, which could be chalked up to God was on their side, or there must be something for which God is punishing us for us to have dropped to this low depth. But natural forces like rain and frost, and whether or not the harvest is quite enough to keep us going for another season. There also, like the carefully, and this is something that Monica was mentioning, the carefully constructed strata of hierarchy in the social order was not something that you could circumvent so easily. And as Lisa was pointing out, you know, your gender role and even the verbs that are ascribed to you and taking certain actions determined by your gender, these are all incredibly rigid. This is the way that the world worked. It was very determined to operate in a certain way because so much did feel and was chaotic. So I don't think that it means that there's no presence for free will in the ancient Near East. I don't think that. But I am not necessarily surprised when a thoughtful student such as yourself notices this pattern and makes an observation about it. It does sort of like square within me. I can see where they're coming from.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. All right, Ben had his hand up, and Shep, I saw your hand go up and down, and no pressure at all, but I just wanted to say that I saw you.
Okay.
And if you don't put your hand back up, I'll call on Judy and Lisa again. So Ben, go right ahead.
Like Sherry, I was struck by verse 9.
Sure.
And the idea of pre-prescribed judgment, almost like Rosh Hashanah Yikatevu Yom Tzom Kippur.
Yeah.
And it kind of didn't add up, but on further reading, this verse actually ties up the two halves of the psalm.
Mm-hmm.
Joy at the beginning and the militaristic part at the end, that the joy arises from Israel becoming the agent of carrying out this verdict.
Ooh. That's beautiful. And I love your, honestly, like in your translation, I love your use of verdict when we're talking about the Hebrew word mishpat, which can be, you know, read as judgment. You know, King James and JPS are using decree, which does ring of high holiday themes and ideology. That something should be written. And yes, Ben, that this is not, you know, God's outstretched arm creating all of these things to come. It is Israel as the tool, the weapon, the agents, you know, and the living embodiment of this destiny. Thank you. All right, Shep.
Hi, Rabbi. I wish you wouldn't use the metaphor of an outstretched arm. Some of us, you know, anyway. I have a dumb question.
I hear you, and I am sure that chapter of Exodus is very difficult, and
Very
especially
difficult.
during the Passover Seder.
Terrible. You have no idea. I have a stupid question. The word anavim, doesn't that mean grapes?
It's not a stupid question, as none of your questions are, Shep. but in this context, you're having a homophone experience where is the
Anavim
seen-
Adumim.
we have yes, and you're thinking of Bashana Haba'a, which is one of my favorite songs too.
Benet.
Where am I where is that actual line?
I think
And
the
this
third.
is
5.
sorry, 5.
Okay.
Here's Hasidim. Even though I can't jump
4.
4. All right. Anavim, here we go. Thank you. I think that was Cantor Nimi's voice. This is a noun that we've seen used before in our study of the Psalms. And so this is about, God raising up the lowly, in my head, the idiom that immediately follows is like me'afar dal, like those, and Cantor Nimi, I'm so glad you raised your hand because I remember you speaking about what a beautiful, resonant phrase this was for you when we were studying the Egyptian Hallel, the Hallel Mitzri of 113 through 118.
Yes, because we see this word used. It's used in a lot of places.
Here's the word we're talking about,
in text. And so it has kind of 2 layers of meaning that can depend upon context. Sometimes it can just mean the humble, because like Moses has an appellation, a nickname, He'anav, the humble one. And so a kind of self-imposed lowliness in some way, shape, or form, but with a kind of positive connotation. But it can also mean where that lowliness is imposed upon you by an external force, and so like afflicted or wretched, or sometimes those kinds of translations. And so it really depends upon the context. Given the context of this verse giving victory or salvation to the Anavim, I would think it's probably the latter connotation, where that lowliness has been imposed upon a group.
Got it. And so your reading would be that they are freed, they are liberated with this salvation from that status.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's strong. I could make an argument, just to like play devil's advocate, that because it's a desirable trait by God, maybe it is the former, that it should be how we see ourselves, because this is God's greatest delight and desire. But honestly, I agree with you. I think in context, it's probably more about external factors. And then that brings us back to Sherry's reading about determinism and all of the different factors that can be brought to bear on someone's situation and status to make you one of the Anavim.
Perhaps
Shep,
both layers are present.
So it's not a grape. How do you spell grapes then? Is it the same spelling?
Let me pull it out. I'm a terrible speller, honestly, but I'll pull it out of Morphix for you.
He adorns the grapes.
While Lisa is speaking, and then I see Judy, Harold, and back to Dratfields.
Oh, just what I put in the chat. I just found this, because just to follow my thought from before, by the time of that dedication of the Second Temple, the drums are gone, and so are the women. And I was looking at that. I was, the Levitical orchestra is a male orchestra, right? And the dancing and the drums are gone, and the chanting. Now they're all singing, and they're singing text. And there's a division between dancing and between text, but that's a whole other drash. But
I would love you to give that drash. Are you free on Saturday morning? Anyway.
Oh, I'd love to work it up anytime. I need some help, but I'd love to. So, but just the sort of the images, and I'm just wondering if the psalm is actually written around the dedication of the Second Temple, because, look at the images of the builders and the swords and the trumpets sort of all being together in this text in Nehemiah.
Right, and you put that in the chat for everybody to see.
Yes.
So I will refer people back. Lisa put it in there at 10:33 a.m. if you're scrolling backwards.
So just to give another meaning to that sword as being, the trumpet is, alerts you to threats and, galvanizes tribe, and the sword is you're ready to fight for the tribe. And it gives it a sort of different spin.
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right, Judy, and then Harold.
I just am still stuck on vengeance, because that's when that line 7, when the two-edged sword sort of woke me up, but then vengeance, and then it was a very negative reaction that I had. But I became a little more honest, and I put it in the chat. And I think that vengeance is all of, I mean, I have horrible feelings that I will not express. For people, say in this example, who are anti-vaxxers for the COVID vaccine. Now, if somebody's in this group, just ignore that I said this, or don't ignore it. But so I do not think that there's anything primitive or biblical. I think vengeance is current, and that we all have these feelings. We may not want to have them, because I was really negative when the word came up, but it's extraordinarily human to this day. Ad hayom, ad hayom.
Totally, Judy. I agree with you. And all of us, so there's this particular book of social psychology by Jonathan Haidt, it's called The Righteous Mind. And he talks about moral taste receptors, and how for some cultures, our moral taste receptors are inverse. You know, what one culture considers to be clean and pure, another culture will consider to be dirty and despicable. But it is sort of encoded into our upbringing what we see as beyond the pale. What are the boundary lines for each of us that is completely unacceptable in society, that draws up these feelings in us of vengeance? And this is basically as old to human experience as our DNA. So yeah, we might poo-poo and say we have evolved like through our enlightenment and our emancipation, and we are still like, just say the right word to the right person and they will be vengeance driven. I think that's a fair reading. All right, Harold.
As someone who goes to a morning service and davens through 145 through 150 every morning, it has been a fascinating experience to actually read the Psalms carefully line by line, which you don't get to do in the 4 minutes in which you do them. And this one turning dark towards the end makes me realize how many Psalms really have parts that if you were writing liturgy to express your feelings at a certain time, you would not have that line in it. Even on Friday night, you know, one of the Psalms that starts beautifully and then winds up with, for 40 years you vexed us in the wilderness, which is not exactly what you would be saying. And Psalm 37, which is set so beautifully by the rivers of Babylon, the last line is, happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks.
Yep.
So it makes me feel that some of them seem like, and then 23, of course, is perfect from the beginning to the end. And does But it also, I remember going to the Psalms, there was a series of Psalms concerts at Lincoln Center, and I was thinking it would be all the settings of all the lines, and I brought my book, and almost all Psalm settings for are settings of 1 or 2 lines or 3 or 4 lines, where the composer chooses the lines that say what they want to use. Not, you don't set dash the children upon the rocks. So these are in some ways primitive from a more brutal society. They go places you wouldn't go if you were writing liturgy. But I think that that's one of the reasons they're so interesting to wrestle with as part of our liturgy, because they're not easy. They're not written, they're not children's rhymes. They're very complicated.
And children's rhymes are also pretty dastardly as well, right? And this is all, Harold, as you're saying, you know, these are products of their time, and their power is endurance through time. And usually that's because there are certain keys that still unlock something profound within us, whether that is, you know, glory and exaltation and excitement, things that we would associate positively, or still sometimes, you know, you are there was some perfect confluence in this class of like, you were reading a psalm about and the recount was going on, and everybody could tap into those feelings of vengeance. for the modern day and like the wicked being brought to justice in a really gruesome way, which on your days as your best self as a 21st century citizen, you would not like to describe yourself as. But so Harold, I would complicate that definition of perfect for the time, because, you know, in every moment something else is perfect for every different person. But I absolutely agree with you that, you know, when we're doing our greatest hits, and usually when we are writing a composition to be shared, we go for the lines that we like the most. Even the Yoel Sykes composition that I shared with you yesterday, and all of us loved Psalm 148, line after line. It just got better and better. He only picked the first half of the psalm, of a great psalm that isn't even that long, because that's sort of what the moment called for. I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. All right, I'm going to call on Betsy, because I haven't seen Betsy's hand yet, and then the Dratfields, and I think that will take us to 10:50. Oh, how you do?
Hi, sorry. So I just wanted to add, in talking about, children's rhymes, that and psychologists have really spoken to this, that when we and I think it's interesting thinking about the psalm, that when we sanitize everything we either teach our children or we have in our own lives, it doesn't allow us to process these range of emotions. Mm-hmm. And so that there's real value, even though they might be scary, with children's rhymes and some of the stories I remember reading to my daughter. And it's something to think about in terms of some of this. I mean, we've talked about how this touches just the conversation today about vengeance and all the different things that get prompted. And so I just want to suggest, in a similar way, this may help us deal with certain emotions we either want to deny or not pay attention to in a more in a healthier way, that we're actually practicing and letting them go and allowing them, as opposed to just sanitizing everything.
Absolutely. And look, some of your language just brought me on sort of a virologist metaphor, so forgive me, but what does it mean to create an immune system? Right? If you sanitize everything completely, you have no inherent resilience to challenges to the system. And I love what you said about, you know, the stories that endure, that we tell over and over again to new generations, even when they're very young, that allow space for this whole complex range of emotions that don't just cast us as characters who feel one way all the time, but who have the ability to hold and process and experience dark feelings as well as light feelings, and that both of these are beautiful. Both of these are essential, and both of these are extremely sacred. It is not a positive or a negative trait, or a negative and a positive trait. All right, Dratfields get the last word today.
So almost building on that, if we think about what do we take away from this psalm as 21st century people, I found it very enlightening to understand the vengeance and the binding and the punishment in historical terms, what it might mean, what it might be as an expression of God's, what was written. But if you think about the worst things that people have done to one another over history, many of them have been in the name of, we're doing God's will.
Yep, absolutely.
And so what do we take from this? I think we have to be very careful, because we can understand it maybe from a historical perspective, but that doesn't mean they were right either.
Yeah.
And certainly the historical precedent has, people have taken this the wrong way and used it in the most horrible of ways.
Absolutely. I personally love what Lisa put into the chat. What would the Wizard of Oz be without the Wicked Witch? And also, that's a complex story. That's why it's so good. She's mourning the loss of her sister from an external event that makes no sense, that she was just like squished by a house out of nowhere. And so I think that Simon, when we talk about, I'm going to bring down the translation so that we can see each other's faces. When we talk about reaching for reasons, why am I motivated to take this action? Is it because I see it as my destiny? Is it because I do it in the name of God, or you know, a lofty reasoning that is beyond simple cause and effect, action and consequence? And when we see ourselves in these texts, both for the enduring nature of their humanity, that we have always done this. We have always reached for poetry and predestination to describe the choices that we make in our lives. We must be careful. And human beings throughout time always had to be careful. Are you doing things for the right reasons? What goes into your mental math of making something the right reason for its time? And is there something more transcendent that we could all tap into about, you know, in our modern moment, the universality of human experience that connects us? Or in other moments, the ties that bind us uniquely together that do set us against in distinct contrast to other people. And both of those are animating factors that are not going away. In the 22nd century, in the 23rd century, we will still find ourselves driven by these internal crusades, or at least I hope so, because that means that humanity has survived with all of our best and all of our worst capabilities. What a wonderful way to conclude our study of most of the Psalms of Psuke de Zimra. The only thing that could be better is if we could all listen and sing to beautiful music together. So that's what we'll do when we see each other at 10 a.m. tomorrow. And we learned from some of the fabulous musicians in our community. And when you encounter these Psalms again, whether it's 145, which you hear on the regular, whether it's 148, which you've just discovered is so lovely, or whether it's 149, which you now no longer just like speed through without looking carefully at what it has to say, I hope that there is a deeper sense of intimacy and a relationship that feels real instead of superficial with the words of the very last selections of the Book of Psalms. Thank you, everybody. It was great spending the morning with you.